Hello, everyone. Welcome to Casual Conversations. This is the 28th episode, which started with the first couple from the Brain Injury Professional magazine, which is published by NAVIS and IBIA. And we are just literally under 2 weeks from the IBIA conference. I think we're over 600 people have signed up to attend. I know we have speakers from over 25 countries. There are rates by country. There are reduced rates for trainees for certain countries. It's affordable, I think, for everybody, and we really hope that you attend. And that will be Wednesday, 28th, 29th, and 30th. And PINK will have a 3-day track. The first day, Wednesday, we'll look at domestic violence and TBI. The afternoon, we'll look at women that are incarcerated and rates of TBI. The Thursday event will be sex differences in the morning and gender in the afternoon. And then I'm really excited for the third day, which will be systemic barriers to Black women with the experience of brain injury and Black female professional or male and female professionals in the brain injury space. And that will be a really amazing event. So that brings us to today, to my guest, Chris Giza. Hi, Chris. Welcome to the show.
Hey, Catherine. Happy to be here. Excited to have a casual conversation.
And you are checking in from your office in LA, true?
Yep, in UCLA, the brain sport program here in the Wasserman building. Just finished my in-person and virtual clinic about 10 minutes before this Zoom. So I'm happy to have a little chat with you now.
Well, it's great to have you on. So usually the first thing that I ask a guest is about their childhood and their interest in science and how they started their journey to become a brain injury professional.
Wow. Okay. Well, my childhood story starts out. I was raised a poor Chinese American boy on a farm in West Virginia, which sounds ridiculous, but that's actually the truth. I grew up on a farm in West Virginia. My parents, though, were not sort of your average farmers. They were both organic chemists. So science was emphasized, and I had been decreed at a young age that I would be the doctor in the family. Fortunately for me, my interests aligned with that. And so, going through sciences in college and going to medical school ended up fitting really nicely with what I ended up wanting to do. So
it was always your intention to be a doctor?
It was always their intention for me to be a doctor. And I would say around the time I was a junior or senior in college, it became my intention too. Yeah.
That's awesome. Were there any moments where you doubted that you could make it happen?
I think I had two rebellious moments. One was when I was a sophomore and I was a declared chemistry major because, again, my parents were both chemists. And I changed my major from chemistry very defiantly to biochemistry.
Ooh, that's rebellious now.
And then when I finished college, I actually had applied to medical school at West Virginia, but my intent was to wait a year and continue the research that I had been doing in the lab with my undergraduate mentor. And when they were calling me in the lab to see if I was going to accept for that fall, one day I wasn't there. I was doing my second job, which was a pizza delivery job. And my lab mentor got the phone. And once he realized that I hadn't yet accepted the application, the acceptance to medical school, when I came back into lab that evening, he read me the Riot Act and told me he would kick me out of the lab and that I should just go to med school. I shouldn't take the year off for research. He said, you'll do research later if you really want to do it, but just go take the opportunity now. Smart guy. I just found out last month he got nominated into he was brought into the National Academy of Sciences, T.Y. Chang, who was a biochemist up at Dartmouth. So gave me good advice 30 years ago, and he's still doing some great stuff now, it sounds like.
That's great. So the research appealed to you at a young age?
Yep. I mean, with two chemists for parents, I think it was pretty natural. And I did the science fairs when I was in high school, and, worked in a lab really starting as a sophomore in college, and have worked in some type of laboratory research continuously since so I was a sophomore when I was 18. So now I'm 56. So you can do the math. I'm a little old, but I've been doing research in some form or another for 3 or 4 decades now.
So how old were you when you told your parents to stop helping you with your homework?
I don't know that I ever told them. I'm not sure they ever did.
Did you ever call them from college and ask a question?
No, I wasn't that kind of a teenager. Once I went off to college, I was off. Yeah.
And so what was your best science fair project?
My best science fair project was the one science fair project I did that didn't win first prize. It was my last science fair project, and I had made a alcohol distillery thing in the basement, and it exploded. And so I actually didn't even get to bring it into the science fair. And of course, once it blew up while I was at school. My parents obviously figured out what experiment was going on down there, and they pretty much shut down my basement lab my senior year in college. So I mean, senior year in high school. So, but it was still the most fun. And part of it, I think, was the subterfuge of thinking that I was getting away with something. But didn't win any awards with that one. Just a big mess to clean up when I came home.
Now, have you worked with your own children on science fair projects?
Some, my son is 17 now, and he's actually really got a musical interest. So he's very intense on playing violin, but he can actually pick up any instrument and play it. And he has about 10 instruments in his room, which he will move from one to the other. I don't have that kind of ability, but probably got it from his mom.
That's awesome. So when did chemistry and how did chemistry switch over to the sports brain space?
Well, sports brain was probably something I never could have envisaged, right? I knew I wanted to work in brain. When I was in college, they didn't have a department of neuroscience per se. So there were some people in biochemistry, there were some people in physiology who worked in neuro-related stuff. My biochemistry mentor worked in cholesterol metabolism, so I didn't even do anything at that time directly related to neuroscience because it wasn't its own thing then. But I think I always wanted to eventually, I said, well, I wanted to work in neuroscience in some way. And I looked carefully at neurosurgery, neurology, pediatric neurology, psychiatry, child psychiatry, even neuroradiology and stuff like that. Because I think I wanted to work in the brain area. And once I got into neurology, and even then I couldn't really choose because I ended up doing both adult and child neurology. But once I went into neurology, it seemed like there would be no way to align that with doing sports or physical activity. That wasn't really a neurology kind of specialty, right? So I went into traumatic brain injury, which actually at that time wasn't much of a neurology specialty either. There weren't really people who specialized in that. And most of my clinical work was in the ICU with more severely injured kids. And then following them, but the unique thing that I could do that a surgeon didn't do or that an intensivist wouldn't do is, even though I took care of them sometimes in the ICU, then when they left the ICU and went to rehab, they could still come and see me in clinic. And then once they got out of rehab and they were back at home and in school, a lot of times kids with more severe injuries still had things they needed. They maybe had seizures or learning problems, then they could still see me. So I really liked that continuity.
And what years are we in there?
Well, that was, I did my child neurology training. I finished in 96. And then, let's see, I started my clinic in 2001. So from 2001 to probably like 2007 or 2008, most of the pediatric brain injury patients who I saw were actually patients who I had seen in the hospital.
Okay.
Very few, at that time, actually, very few kids with concussion came to see neurologists anyway,
Right.
And it only happened around between 2007, 2010, there were a couple of things. One was there was a lot of publicity about sports-related injuries in professional sports. And then there was also a lot of awareness about sort of the invisible injury of military service members in Iraq and Afghanistan. And so I had a brain injury clinic, and it'd be in 2007, 2008, 2009, we just started noticing patients who'd had concussions or mild traumatic brain injury started coming to the clinic also, and of course now the program is probably 80% what we would otherwise refer to as mild TBI or concussion, but usually those people who had more persistent problems or unusual problems.
And those years, my son had his first series of concussions in 2008, and just entering that space at that time, at a parent, it seemed that they had just dropped Bob Cantu's graded concussion scale, and now concussion included those that didn't include loss of consciousness. So it really opened up a new group of people that were coming in for care.
Yeah, I mean, and you bring up, I think one of the challenges in the field that remains a challenge to this day is kind of our sort of vague and subjective definition for what constitutes a concussion or a mild head injury. And so, I think we're working toward making what do I want to say? I've been calling it a probabilistic diagnosis, but it's really like creating a diagnosis of concussion that's more on a spectrum. So, there's clearly cases where somebody gets hit in the head, they can't walk straight or can't remember for a few seconds, and then they gradually begin on the path to recovery. And you would say, well, that's definitely a concussion. There's neurologic dysfunction caused by the biomechanical impact. But we also all see patients where, somebody was playing a contact sport and there wasn't a particularly big hit, and the patient had history of migraine and developed a really bad headache after practice. And in that case, I'm less inclined to say that was a definite concussion. I said maybe it's a possible concussion or an exertional migraine. And so I think the idea that we're moving toward concussion diagnostic criteria that more accurately reflect some of the clinical uncertainty that we have when we see these patients. This is a definite concussion. This is probably a concussion. I'm going to treat it like a concussion, but it could be something else. And then I would say about 5 or 10% of the patients we see in clinic, we undiagnose with concussion. After we take the whole history and everything, and we do our testing, and it turns out, maybe this is a child who had ADHD and was having problems in school, or like I said, exertional migraine,
or cervical spine.
Cervical has a lot of things. So, so it's interesting because I think a lot of folks who are in the area of sports neurology, which is kind of the area that has developed around head injuries in sport and head injuries in physical activity, everybody thinks of it as concussion clinics, but actually, we also take care of a lot of patients who never had a concussion but want to play a sport, but they have autism or cerebral palsy, or they have migraines or epilepsy, and how can they play a sport safely? Or patients who thought they had a concussion, and after we're, do a careful evaluation, we say, well, probably this thing wasn't a concussion. And, that sort of changes people's outlook on what to expect. And I think it's important. I think the other part of sports neurology that we don't hear as much about, but I think is equally fascinating and I think interesting to me, is how sports and physical activity help our brains and help us to think more clearly, have more attention, better blood flow, better growth factors in the brain. And so I think when we talk about sports or military service or, risky professions that involve, risk for head injury, we balance out the risk of getting the injury with the benefit of the activity. Because I think that's the other thing we see is that, I have had a few kids who I've returned to football after a concussion, and it's been a good thing for them, and I've had a kid with epilepsy who wanted to play football, and we were able to let him play football his senior year in high school, and it worked out very well for him. So I think balancing and trying to understand the risks and benefits, and also thinking about kids who have other developmental issues, who have autism, who have maybe cerebral palsy, but want to participate in a group sport. Right now, the odds are really stacked against them. there's not really a way to be inclusive for them. And so we're working with some of our colleagues in developmental neurosciences to create ways so they can do kind of ability appropriate interaction with group sports so they can get the benefits of socialization and physical fitness.
That's awesome. I want to go back a little bit to your Cascade of Concussion. That was published in 2003?
2001, I think, was the first paper on that. Yeah.
Okay, so can you dovetail that into the clinical side?
Yeah, well, that was, so I had, after I finished my clinical training, I did some weird things. I spent a couple years living in a tent in Yosemite. A lot of people have heard this story before. I worked on the search and rescue team for a couple years, trying to decide what area of neurology I wanted to specialize in. And then when I came back from that, I did basic science training in the lab of Dr. David Hovda, who was the director of the UCLA Brain Injury Research Program. And so I worked in the lab trying to further my interest in research, trying to understand how does head injury affect the brain, and particularly does it affect the developing brain differently than the adult brain. And so I essentially hung up my MD for a while and worked as a postdoc until 2001. So in 2001, I was just coming back to starting up my clinic again, but I was mostly working in the lab. And Dr. Hovda had the opportunity for us to write this review article that kind of summarized a lot of the work that the group had been doing. And I was relatively new in the group. So I took that as an opportunity to familiarize myself with, 100 or 200 publications, a lot from UCLA, but a lot from other places, and try to put them together. And I think, full disclosure, and it was full disclosure in the paper itself, is most of the work that's published there is not work that I did personally. It was my interpretation and synthesis of work that was done by lots of people. And then I put a little bit in there on some of the work I was doing as a postdoc, looking at the developmental brain after concussive injury in the laboratory setting. But something about that article really resonated. It got to an audience of people that could really understand it and think about concussion and head injury in a different way. And so, there's no living it down now. At the time, I thought this was a journal. A journal of athletic training wasn't even in PubMed, so we didn't realize even people would find it. But it's turned out to be one of the more important papers that I've had a chance to participate in, and so I'm grateful for that opportunity, and glad that it's been helpful for people.
And just for people that don't know what we're talking about the Cascade of Concussion, and it basically, in layman's term, talks about the chemical reaction at the moment of the injury and then going out. I think you went out 30 days and the different chemical reactions that happen, the Cascade of Concussion, that showed that brain injury changed over time depending on how the body was responding. Is that a good summary?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, one of the things back in the 70s and 80s, when I was growing up, people weren't even sure if a concussion was, a brain injury, or was it just a bunch of symptoms and psychosomatic. And so, what we learned in the lab with concussive injuries is we could measure all these chemicals changing in the brain. Sugar metabolism changed, and neurotransmitters moving in the brain changed, and ions and minerals, magnesium and calcium and potassium and sodium were all changing. And so, and that work had been being done even really 10 or 15 years before I became a postdoc. People were doing that. So I think, but putting it into an article altogether and then connecting it to what we see in patients, I think opened some eyes that this isn't quote unquote psychosomatic. It's a biological injury happening here. And, fortunately for a lot of folks, it gets better. But for those that don't, it's important for us to figure that out and be able to take care of them.
Now, as a parent educator at the time, so 2009, 10, 11, 12, I had in my slide deck, whether I was talking to a football team or a PTA, parents group of any kind, I had slides in there about the chemical cascade. Like, it really was, even if people just got just a cursory moment of what we were talking about, the idea that it was a change over time. And I thought that was really important for parents to realize and have a sense of the injury. So that's first how I heard your name. So I have a little slide deck to embarrass you.
Uh-oh.
I know, it's my show, so I get to embarrass you. So I have a little slide deck here, just a couple pictures. So this is my slide deck of Chris, Giza, and PINK Concussions, to embarrass you. So this is the first time I remember. I must have met you at another conference because I went out to Chicago, and this was the first sports concussion conference that you and Dr. Kritcher put together, true?
Yes, yep. The inaugural sports concussion conference.
And I think there were like 600 neurologists and me in a room in a beautiful weekend in Chicago. But it really helped me to understand some of the frustration of neurologists working with post-concussive or prolonged concussion symptoms now patients. And there was sort of a disconnect between the two groups at that time. And I remember them all asking you basically, like, how do we help these people? What's the step forward with this? So I felt like that was a really important meeting.
Well, I'm glad you do, and I hope a lot of people do. You know, that meeting is still going strong. So in another week, right after IBIA, the AAN Sport Concussion virtual meeting will be, I think it'll be the 7th year now. So I'm no longer directing it. We turned that over after 4 years, but I'm really proud of what the meeting has become. And I think when you attend the meeting now, well, hopefully this year it's going to be virtual, but next year it'll be in person again. You won't be trapped in a room with 600 neurologists. Now it's 300 neurologists and 300 other sports medicine experts. So we've really balanced it so that about half the attendees are not neurologists, but sports medicine, athletic trainers, neuropsychologists, and stuff like that. And I think that better reflects the community that takes care of patients with concussion and persistent post-concussive symptoms.
Right.
So I'm
It was a great conference. It was the first time I presented. I was accepted and I presented my first research paper, and I did it with Clemson University. And I don't think we were even published then, because it got published in 2016. So that's the first time I met you. And I remember talking, you were so supportive of what I was doing. And then we had the infamous PASS tour of 2015.
Yes.
So the PASS tour was a great idea that didn't exactly congeal the way I think the organizers thought. And it was a group of concussion experts. I still don't know how I got pulled into the mix, but we went, I think, to 8 different cities and put on concussion conferences to very small groups. But the idea was we were staying in hotels. So I literally, I think everybody hanging out together in that group really formed some strong bonds that we all moved forward and were able to do some great things from that tour.
Yeah, you summarized it pretty well. I think we had high hopes for it, and it didn't get as much traction as we would have liked. But I think, that's the part of all of these things. I mean, think about where concussions and sports neurology are now compared to even 6 or 7 years ago. And think about where public awareness is now, is much more mature. So I think all of these efforts help move the dial, and some of them end up being, tremendously successful, and some have more modest success, but every one of them contributes to getting the message out there.
Well, it certainly was a great opportunity to hang for that group to form. And you and I had talked about PINK Concussions at the time, and we had become a nonprofit, and you were very encouraging. And then we were in Denver in July, and I was telling you I finally had gotten a location to the Georgetown event at Georgetown, but I didn't have any speakers. So that's when you helped me and put your name down along with mine. And we basically invited 65 top experts to come speak at Georgetown, and they all said yes. So here's the Georgetown event. You spoke, and those are all speakers. And I think we had close to 250 people attend. It ended up being one of the top 10 conferences in that year for a first time event. And then this is PINK 2, where you called it PINK 2, which then we started using the numbering system, and that's out at Palo Alto. So you really have been such a part of PINK Concussions and supporting the work that I was doing while I was not associated with any big institution. I don't have a PhD. So just wanted to ask you kind of why did you jump on board for a relatively unknown person and put yourself out there?
Well, I mean, in the end, you turned out to be a pretty good person. So that.
Oh yeah, but at the time it was a little sketchy.
But I think, I mean, but you know, the message that you were trying to get out, I think, resonated with me as one that was not being heard in the area of concussions. You know, concussions at that time were, you know, emerging from relative obscurity, and because of the focus on professional sports and military, you know, almost nothing was being said about, you know, concussion in women who participate in lots of sports, you know, and have injuries and have, you know, a lot of our work now is focusing on distinctions of injury and recovery in males versus females. And, you know, we're all humans, but we do have different recovery rates and different comorbidities. So, but at that time, there wasn't really a platform to have that kind of focus. And I think, you know, one of the things I'll say sheepishly that I learned from working with you was, you know, even at that first sport concussion meeting, you know, we were woefully inadequate in women representation, both in the field as speakers and participants, but also in topics, you know, and some of that is a bias built into the people who are in sports neurology and sports medicine at the time, but I don't think that's really an excuse. And, you know, we've done I think if you look at all of the meetings now, they've done a much better job about greater integration of female faculty and female experts and female concussion sufferers telling their story. And also, you know, and you'll see next week a little bit, because I'll talk about even some of the basic science coming out of our group now is really focused on sex differences in injury response and recovery. And we're really finding that there are some biological differences in the way the female and male brain respond to injury. Whereas at the time of the neurometabolic Cascade paper, you know, 99% of all basic science research in traumatic brain injury was male rats, you know, and no one was even thinking about these things. So I think I'll give you credit for bringing that awareness and sticking with it now through PINK 10, you know, so that's fantastic.
Yeah, and it was actually that paper that I started, the research project that I did in 2012 when I was kind of sidelined with chemo and radiation. I couldn't travel, and I had put out on Twitter, and we definitely connected through Twitter, and I had over 600 responses in 1 month of women that wanted to take part in the study. And there was this little tiny box where I said women had to sign up to be part of the project, and then I would send them the survey. But in this little box, there was like questions and comments, and women wrote full stories in that little box of how they were suffering. So I had this sense of women needing their voice to be heard. And at the time, you know, I would say, well, I don't know truly if it's biological or not, but there's enough women that aren't being heard that we need to pursue this. And really, you know, I think Doug Smith's paper and everything that's coming out is really showing biological as well as gender differences. But at the time, you're right, we just didn't know. I just knew there was a group suffering.
Yeah, I don't want to get too academic, but we did, you know, I was pretty excited because we just published a paper in JAMA Network Open. So it's open to access, so everybody can see it, on pediatric patients with concussion recovery at multiple centers. It's part of our Four Corners Consortium. And one of the interesting things we saw there was that we've known that post-traumatic headaches prolong recovery or are associated with prolonged recovery. But in that study, we actually broke up the post-traumatic headaches into migraine and non-migraine headaches. And what we found is that actually the post-traumatic migraine headaches that are associated with the longer recovery and the non-migraine post-traumatic headaches ended up falling back into a normal recovery curve. So one of the things that made me start thinking about is the idea that after head injury, when people have these more prolonged symptoms, that it's not a single diagnosis. And so we're calling them sort of endophenotypes, and there may be a migraine endophenotype. And if the biology of migraine, which matches a lot with the biology of concussion, is a risk factor for prolonged recovery, then is some of what we see in the gender difference in recovery due to the fact that women have 2 to 3 times more likelihood of migraine, and the onset of migraine typically is in adolescence, which is when we're studying a lot of these sport concussions. And so there is a sex or gender difference if you look by that variable, but maybe it's actually related to a different underlying biology. And yeah, I mean, I could go on. I'll rein myself in, but I have a great research scientist working with me, Dr. Annie Hoffman, who's shown in the laboratory that after the same kind of experimental head injuries, concussive injuries in the rodent, she measures objectively sensory sensitization. How do they respond to auditory stimulus? How do they respond to light stimulus? And when do they adopt a defensive posture? So the noise makes them scared, or the light makes them retreat. And it turns out after head injury, all of those sensory processes are increased, but there's a clear sex difference. And the female rats after the concussion have enhanced, phonophobia, if you will, and enhanced photophobia. And so we don't know yet why. We haven't figured out the biology of why that happens, but we know it's not just psychosomatic, and we know there's not really probably due to any kind of social construct around, how paternalistic doctors are in returning people to activity, because these are rats living in a cage. There's
Right.
really some biological difference. And I mean, it's just fascinating to think about that when I started working in traumatic brain injury, we wouldn't even think of studying female rats because it's too complicated to add another variable, and now we're finding all these really important things.
Well, and I did want to say I have had the pleasure of actually going out for drinks with people in your lab, and you have fabulous people working with you, and you have incredible women scientists that I know that you support their work, Tiffany's work, and I think that you have also not only helped the female side of brain injury along with your own presence and helping PINK Concussions, but also supporting women scientists in your lab.
Well, it's because it's not a question of whether they're a man or a woman. It's a question of, are they doing good stuff? And, men don't have a corner on being smart or coming up with good ideas. I found actually a lot of the good ideas are coming out of folks who didn't often have as much of a platform or opportunity to do that. So whatever I can do at this stage in my career to facilitate that, it's incredibly gratifying to see young scientists of all backgrounds, coming up and putting in fresh ideas. And I think only in the last year are we, made even more aware of some of the disparities that still exist really in academic medicine. And, I think, we're trying to think of ways where we can really reach out to even younger, to high school. We have I think 8 high school interns this summer. Now it's still virtual for them, but reaching out to people when they're very young and trying to find opportunities for them to get excited about neuroscience in the brain, the same kind of way that opportunities that we had when we were younger.
Absolutely, and it is very important that we have that to support women, people of color, indigenous, all different groups, because the field of brain injury is so young. Just in the short time that you and I have been in the field, how much has changed. And I think that's what's exciting about brain injury, is it really is, an emerging science. There's so much to figure out, and there's so much space for people to come in and, add to the overall picture. What would you like to do in the future as we wrap this up? What given all the funding or the you know, you are a connector. You're someone that is always on a committee, connecting people, moving other people's ideas forward. You really have a very special place in the brain injury field. What would you like to see happen next, you know, 3 to 5 years?
Well, I mean, I like the way things are going. You know, I think neurotrauma has been trying to be more diverse for a long time. You know, even back in the 90s, they actually had a specific subgroup in the National Neurotrauma Society called Women in Neurotrauma. And now it's called Team Neurotrauma because it's not just for women, but for any underrepresented group. But they've really done a great job. If you look at, you know, the young scientists who are coming into the field are getting more and more diverse. I think, you know, the real challenge, and there's been lots of academic discussion about this, is just that as it moves to the higher level, the people who are the professors, the people who are the presidents of national organizations, you know, people who are in politics, who are making funding decisions about where research money goes, I think that's the next sort of big objective, is to try to get better representation at those levels so that the research and the clinical care in the field can be more representative. A lot of that is not stuff that I can directly do, you know, but it's part of the vision of seeing people come up and be successful. And that's why I still talk to the media, and that's why I talk to, you know, representatives and things like that, because I think it's important. And that's why I talk to the general public. It's important for our stakeholders to understand that we take this responsibility seriously and that we're being good stewards of the resources that are given to us. Scientifically, you know, I think there's a couple of things for our program here specifically that I'm very excited about. We're about to embark on a big NIH study looking at persistent post-concussion symptoms. When that all gets official, you know, we'll hear more about that. We're also working very closely with military service members. I've been affiliated with the group here at UCLA called Operation Mend. And we've for a long time been doing very careful assessments of neurological function in military service members. But a lot of the focus in many of these programs has been on the psychiatric side and post-traumatic stress. And we're very close to launching something that's going to put traumatic brain injury right up there alongside with some of the neurobehavioral challenges that these service members are getting. So that those two big projects are probably going to dominate a lot of my efforts, at least in the next you know, couple of years. So I think that's important. But you know, there's actually quite a lot of young investigators that I've had the pleasure of meeting at meetings, or I'm co-mentoring on one of their grants. Some of them are here, some of them in other places. And, you know, I think probably my most exciting hope for the future is watching them develop their new ideas and move from their training grants to their faculty positions, and really take our field forward. So I think that's, you know, I think I'm enthusiastic about seeing how that goes. I think also another thing I would like to see more of is, because this is what I see in real life with real patients, is that head injury doesn't doom somebody to a life of, you know, dementia and gloom. I mean, I've had head injuries myself, and I've joked about it a little bit, you know, growing up on the farm and kicked by animals and things. But I think that we should really focus, especially on head injuries when they're occurring in people when they're relatively young. You know, there's a whole life to live after that. And there's so many things we know that can promote brain health in the long term: good cardiovascular health, exercise, sleep, cognitive challenges to your brain, and things like that. And so if you have a head injury and you're 30 or 40 years old and you've got another 30 or 40 to go, I think some of our focus should be on what are the factors that make you resilient, and what are the factors that from now going forward, what can you do so that your brain keeps working for you as best as it can for as long as it can, you know? And I like that kind of focus, because it really meshes well with really good big evidence-based studies of long-term cognitive health. And there's actually quite a lot of things we can do when we focus on the longer term picture.
Willie Stewart was on and is very articulate.
Yeah, I like Willie.
I love Willie. So yeah, if you're interested more on that topic, definitely check out the episode with Willie Stewart, who speaks to the paper with the 12 components of, long-term brain health, one of which is your brain injury history. My last question is, are you seeing COVID long haulers come to you? And I just keep reading the scientific papers, and it seems like, they that group is traveling similar pathways. Do you see any COVID patients? Do you see COVID moving the field forward, or is it not your lane?
Well, I think, the whole phenomenon of long COVID will be interesting to see, where it goes. I think the challenge with chronic symptomatic conditions where the symptoms aren't specific for that illness, they're general symptoms. It's kind of like post-concussion syndrome used to be, or even like other syndromes like chronic fatigue syndrome or something like that. Is there are probably some people in there who have biological changes, and we have to separate them from people who have chronic symptoms from something else but are being put into the same basket. So I'm sure I'm seeing some patients who've had COVID. We actually haven't been looking at that systematically. I know that there is growing evidence for persistent symptoms after COVID infection. Our population is mostly pediatric, and so COVID has been, fortunately for us, lighter on the pediatric side. There have been much fewer kids who are infected, and for most of them who got infected, they had a milder course. So we're not overrun with long COVID concussion patients. We do have kind of a survey study that we started during COVID just to see if the situations of the pandemic changed symptom reporting in kids who had persistent symptoms, because we thought for sure the stress and the anxiety and the loss of access to physical activity are other reasons that could make somebody with persistent symptoms worse. And so we're trying to kind of look at that a little bit. I think it'll be, it'll all be part of the picture. There are a lot of people who've had COVID, and they're going to, just like people who've had concussions, they're going to go on living their lives, and figuring out how we can make their symptoms better and have the best brain health in the long term is still going to be important.
And I hope the lessons about the dangers of isolation and the importance of support groups. And it seems like the long haul COVID people have naturally, with social media being so important, gathered in different spaces for support. But yeah, and then the last thing to ask you was, okay, so we're starting back to full sports. I know for this last year, my own project in tracking the concussions in the 11,000 kids in our city was on reserve. So we're starting up again with our school nurses tracking. And I'm hoping that we can use this time to start off and really have, concussion education and sports and everything move forward from a healthy perspective. Do you see this COVID, the stopping of sports for COVID, as a chance to sort of retool, and that concussion education will continue on the path it was? Or do you sense that we might regress a little bit as over the sports space?
Yeah, I think we're going to see both. It's going to depend a lot on, particular regions and particular schools. I think, it's essentially a hard reset for sports participation. So that creates a great opportunity for, as we go into the fall, to start with education and sort of reintroducing kids back to sport, in a knowledgeable and careful fashion. I think there will be, like there is with any sort of human endeavor, there are going to be people who are just like been fed up with not being able to participate for so long, and they're just going to go back, willy-nilly, kind of recklessly, maybe, I don't know. But that won't be their high, like concussion won't be their high priority. So I can imagine in some areas there may also be some regression, but there are I always like to see the glass as half full. And so one of the things, for example, that our group has really been seriously thinking about is, while we really love our experiences where we do preseason testing with young kids at a number of schools that affiliate with us, it's always been a little question of how helpful it is in the long run. It's very time consuming. There isn't good opportunity to give education, and you do get individualized information about them at the beginning of the season. So that is the advantage, but it's really hard to sustain and scale up. If you're going to cover a whole school system like LA Unified, you can't really do it the way we try to do it. That ends up becoming really an access to care. One of the things we're thinking about is with telehealth, you don't have to have a doctor or athletic trainer or a nurse at every school. And so one possibility is that we can use telehealth to allow us to get some of our experts access to schools that would be less likely to have an athletic trainer or geographically be isolated away from concussion specialists. And so I think that's an exciting thing coming out of COVID that we might be able to use in our field of sports neurology and sports neuropsychology to actually increase access to care. Obviously, you'll still need to have a way to do an electronic connection, but in terms of smartphones, and most schools have at least some situation where you can do a telehealth setup. I think that's going to really change the game in terms of getting experts from academic centers to be able to help in underserved areas.
Absolutely. I could talk to, there's so many other questions, but I know people, I'm just going to check to see if people have questions. I wanted to just double check if, let's go like a question from a professional and a researcher, and then a question from someone with lived experience. So let's just start out. Are there any researchers or professionals with questions for the first question?
I see that Nicole asked a question in the chat box. Nicole, would you like to voice that, or would you like me to read your question aloud?
Thanks. I don't know which category I fall into, because I do work in the health policy area, but I also have lived experience. So I'm happy to ask it if you'd like me to, or if you want to read it, or.
Sure. She wrote that she agrees and thanks you for asking about COVID. And as a health policy expert, she's worked on coverage issues on legislative and regulatory levels, mostly federal and also international and state, as well as she mentioned, a personal family history of PCS and concussions. So she's wondering if the emphasis on COVID will help with advocacy for concussions, because there's a realization now of the limitations of health coverage and disability, and especially since it's also visible, contrasting with other countries' systems that they have for health coverage, and seeing how there's a visible disparity, I guess, between them and the United States.
Yeah, so, well, the glass half full part of me says, yeah, absolutely, right? As now that these disparities are sort of laid bare for all to see, I think that, the first step to fixing things with policy is recognizing there's a problem there. So I think that COVID has done, a great job, if you will, of showing those limitations in our system. The challenges will be, obviously, there are some people who still deny that those disparities, what they're based upon. And I think the other challenge is that, at least at the moment, and until we get to a place where COVID is under better control and where kids are actually back in school, there's still a lot of debate about the risks of kids in school, even though the data shows that it's pretty safe. But until that is resolved, I think, the challenge will be that COVID will suck up a lot of the air in the room, and it'll be hard for a school with limited resources to be paying attention to getting kids back to school safely for COVID and still be thinking about sports and concussions and things like that. But hopefully we can make them pay attention to all of that.
Allison, you had a question?
Hi there, can you hear me?
Yep. Hi, Allison.
Professional and also with lived experience too. You mentioned having a number of pediatric patients who you would see with a concussion diagnosis, who with further assessment, you would re-diagnose. Can you say what a lot of those re-diagnoses would end up being?
Yeah, I mean, it depends a little bit on when they come to see you as to what the other diagnosis is. And sometimes it's completely another diagnosis, and sometimes it's just another diagnosis and still possibly a concussion. But I mean, very common things, exertional migraine is common, cervicogenic injury, like a whiplash injury, is pretty common. We've seen patients with dysautonomia that sometimes manifests as exercise intolerance. Now, whether that's due to concussion or whether that's its own diagnosis, depends on the individual. I mean, there's quite a lot of things. Benign paroxysmal positional vertigo doesn't happen very often, but I remember every single patient I see with that because they can be cured with a relatively simple maneuver in clinic, and they're so grateful. And yet, I think of all the patients with BPPV that I've diagnosed and treated successfully, only, a quarter of them probably saw me in the first couple of weeks. Everyone else came in, they had been diagnosed with post-concussion syndrome for 6 months, and they were going through all different kind of things, and they had this problem. So I think the take-home message is, just because someone was playing a sport and had symptoms, don't I don't want to say this, we want people to be aware and suspect concussions, but I think what has happened is some providers, either because they're worried about legal issues or intellectually lazy a little bit, is just jump to the conclusion that everything is a concussion. And that really does the patient a disservice. If they have migraine, we should treat the migraine. If they have a sleep disorder, they should have that. We had a young woman who was a scholarship basketball candidate. This was years and years ago, and got a concussion playing basketball and couldn't get back to basketball because she couldn't pass the computer test. And we finally saw her with our neuropsychologist, and the neuropsychologist said, well, the reason she's passing the computer test is because she has a learning disability. And they had not given a preseason computer test to the person, so they didn't know. And so when she couldn't pass it after concussion, she was now, weeks and weeks out from her play and, at risk of losing her scholarship. So I think it's just important that there be, that we be thinking about this. And we try to train sports medicine and neurology doctors to think like this, so that we don't just jump to this conclusion and forget that there's a lot of other things that we could be treating also. I think that works really well.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. That's really interesting.
And I'm also a quote unquote expert and have lived experience. I think if you live long enough, it's hard not to have the lived experience of having hit your head and gotten your bell rung sooner or later. So, I think that's also important for people to know that we're all in this together.
And I think we have about 6 minutes left. So we'll go to sort of a faster round. Nat Dean, would you like to share?
Hi, thank you. That's an excellent discussion. I sustained my first head injury in 1984. 7 years later, was diagnosed. But in that 7-year period, I had complete maxillofacial surgery reconstructions. And talking to the maxillofacial surgeon, I think about 29 years later, just to ask some questions about, are we sure the hardware is titanium or not titanium, because we didn't want to take a chance with an MRI. I said, the reason I didn't come out of anesthesia so easily is I actually was diagnosed with a traumatic brain injury. And he said, oh, I'm so relieved. I felt so bad, like we'd done something to you. And so I think in going through all of the lived experience and now being an advocate and consultant in disability policy, is we need to help people through that process of accessing care, knowing what questions to answer, knowing what questions to ask, where to look for those answers. And that's where I think having someone help you navigate through this as a patient advocate, because being a consumer of the medical system for the first time is hard enough, but doing it with a brain injury is even harder. So these sessions have been wonderful. And hi, Los Angeles. California is my home.
Well, thank you so much for your work to make people aware of that. I think that's often, us ivory tower type get all excited about research or the latest clinical trial, but all that doesn't mean anything if it doesn't actually get to the people who need it. And and we talk a lot about disparities and stuff like that, but access to good information, access to accurate information, and for those who've had an injury and are trying to get access to care, it can be almost impossible problem. So we don't want to lose sight that not only do we have to make better treatments for people with brain injury, but we have to figure out ways, and telehealth may be one of the tools we can use to make it more accessible to a broader range of people. Absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I mean, the way I look at it now is I had to find a way to turn my lemons into lemonade, and becoming an advocate and navigator for people and policy was my solution. Thank you for being part of that solution and your research and your work.
You're welcome. And thanks for what
Thank
you
you,
do.
Nat. What we've been doing lately is taking the chat section and copying and paste it and formatting it for our speakers. So if you have wanted to thank Chris or wanted to have a comment, or you're a colleague and it's not the moment you can jump on, you're welcome to put comments in the chat, and those will go to Chris. Is there anyone else? Kara, I'm going to give you a chance to read the new comments that came up. Is there anyone else that's live that wants to ask a question? And I did want to put out there that our interns are doing a fabulous job on Instagram. They kicked me off and I have my own account now, and the interns have done a great job in taking research, distilling it. It all has the source, and doing some really great Instagram posts with a whole new look. So definitely hit PINK Concussions up on Instagram. Any other questions? I don't see anyone's hands. Anyone?
And
To ask
so
a
I see that Pat had a question. If I can-
Hold on, Cara.
Oh, I'm
Alina?
sorry.
Somebody's trying to speak that has really bad. I'm trying to figure out who it is.
Yes, yeah, if there's time, I'd love to ask. Can you hear me?
Sure.
Oh.
Whoever that was. Yeah, hi.
Hi, can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Much
now we
better
can.
now. Hello.
Okay, good. Well, so my question is about giving patients estimates on their recovery time. I've had a concussion myself, and I'm also work in the field. And I was just wondering what your thoughts are on when a patient asks how the recovery time will be, what you tell them, but I know that oftentimes people would like to know. So I was wondering what your thoughts are.
Yeah, no, that's a great
I
question.
don't know if you got that, Chris, but she was asking on what's recovery time.
Yeah. It's an important question that we're faced with every day, right? Every day somebody comes to see us who has a head injury wants to know, when am I going to be back to normal, or when am I going to be better? And the short answer is, who knows, right? I don't really know. I can't pinpoint it, but we can make pretty educated guesses. And certainly as we follow up patients, as they come back for a second visit or something, we can often figure out the trajectory better. So from the clinician standpoint, there are actually very good prediction rules that have been validated. So you can determine if somebody you can't tell them when they're going to get better, but you can tell, is this somebody who has very few risk factors and is likely to get better faster than average, and that might be somebody then who you would say, you would give a very optimistic outcome and say, maybe you'll follow up with your primary and just come back to us if you need it, okay? Somebody else who has a lot of comorbidities and a lot of risk factors to suggest they might take a long time to get better, I don't usually tell them, well, you're doomed to have a long recovery. I said, you've got some risk factors that said your recovery might be longer. And so to nip that in the bud, what we're going to do is we're going to do these things now. And then rather than have you go back to your primary, we're going to have you come back and see us for a follow-up visit in a few weeks, just so we can make sure what trajectory you're on. So you can start to make the management a little bit different, even up front, without necessarily dooming somebody to a long recovery. When people come with persistent symptoms, once their symptoms are like 3 or 4 months long, then really if determining what the recovery is going to be depends on doing a proper workup and diagnosing whatever those persistent symptoms are, right? So for example, the patient with BPPV who came in with 6 months of post-concussion syndrome, and we did a Hall-Pike maneuver and dislodged the calcium deposit in the ear, and they walked out of clinic cured of the vertigo because of that maneuver. Okay, so their recovery was right away. Somebody with chronic migraine, well, they're probably going to have migraines in their life, but again, there's a lot of treatments we can do to manage the migraine, and including new drugs that have just come out in the last couple of years. So, the more chronic conditions are very readily manageable once you diagnose them properly. And so that's part of it with the patients with longer symptoms, rather than just saying, we're going to wait for it to get better. We actively do some diagnosis and then we start treatments.
Chris, I just noticed we're a little over the top of the hour. I don't want to keep you if you have somebody waiting at your door.
I actually do. I have another TBI friend and colleague, Dr. Sid Hines.
Say hi to Sid.
So he's visiting as part of a Wounded Warrior Project thing that we're working on for military TBI. So I do have to kind of wrap it up. But I heard you say that I'll be able to get there's a ton of good comments in the chat that I've been trying to read as we're going by, but you'll be able to
I will cut and paste the chat for you, so you'll have all of it, and it has people's names and what they've said. Okay. And say hi to Sydney. He will be opening our Black women with lived experience of brain injury, systemic barriers on Friday. Actually, I think he's going to be opening the professional panel. So say hi to him for me. And if you want to follow Chris on Twitter, he's always presenting research, other people's research, things you need to know, and beautiful pictures of his bike trip. So I don't have to ride a bike because I just have Chris to do it for me, and then I can look at his pictures. And he's always the one at a conference who's out on, I never leave the conference centers. I only know about the outside of conference centers because you go out there and take pictures for us. So thank you for everything you've done for me and for PINK Concussions and for the field. And I really appreciate you being here for our final episode.
This was a lot of fun. Thanks everybody for listening and for all the comments. And hopefully we'll do it again sometime.
Yeah, that's great. And so this is our final episode. We'll be back September 2nd. We already have 10 shows booked, so don't forget us in August. And make sure to tune in for the IBIA PINK X coming to you on the 28th through the 30th. So thanks everyone. Take care and have a nice summer. See you in September. Thank you, Chris.